Hello and welcome to the 15th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. In this series I will talk about the 10 cards with the most competitive success in Eternal's history that fulfill a certain condition. In this case they have to be a non-relic weapon. For that I compiled a list of all decks that topped an official Direwolf event or reached top 8 in the ETS seasons of 2017 and 18. The ranking is then based on a point system. Each tier 1 top grants 2 points and each tier 2 top grants 1. Tiers are either based on how far the deck went or on how important the event was. For a more detailed explanation, check out the introduction video on my channel. Non-relic weapons, which means weapons that are played on units instead of the player itself, always come with the inherent risk of being 2-for-1 by a removal spell on the unit carrying the weapon. That means they have to be either so tempo efficient that they are worth taking that risk, or they have to offer some immediate value, or at least the potential for value, the turn they are played, to change a losing into an even or even winning trade. The cards on this list can all be ascribed to one of those two groups, maybe even to both of them, but even then there's a clear downward trend for most of them, indicating that the inherent problem of non-relic weapons became even more impactful with the game's increasing speed over the years. That might be one of the main reasons for the introduction of the versatile weapon type in 2023. Versatile weapons are weapons that can both be used as a relic and non-relic weapon, which means you are no longer forced to risk a 2-for-1. All of them came out too late to ever see play in official tournaments, but a card like Ozo or Longbow would have definitely made this list if tournaments had still existed in its time. With that out of the way, let's start with the cards that did make the list. As always, feel free to write your guesses about which cards made the top of the list, or your questions about how close some cards that you expected to see missed out in the comments. First up, we have Lefray Falcon. It's a 4-power double shadow influence 4/1 rare weapon with lifesteal. Falcon was part of set 1, the Empty Throne, so it was already around when competitive play started. That first ETS season of 2017 was also its most successful period. It was played at a few copies in the 15-card sideboard of a number of different Shadow Aggro and midrange decks throughout the whole season, with the most consistent home being Stonescar Burn Queen, a hyper-aggressive deck with a lot of cheap units, which meant you'd likely have a target for it on board at any time. Towards the end of the 2017 season, it also started to see some mandate play at 4 copies or sometimes 3 copies in one specific deck, Archenport Midrange. That deck was built around Toughrod Auric Banker, who made main deck weapons a lot better because he could draw them for basically free with his attack effect, and buff the attack in the process, which was especially good with Falcon's lifesteal. That deck also included Auric Interrogator, who could convert any weapon into a free draw to make up for potential value losses, and Buffalo with Aegis to make it less likely to get 2-for-1 when you play the weapon, and Unblockable to make it more likely that you can hit the opponent for damage. Archenport Midrange remained successful in early 2018, but Falcon got pushed into the sideboard and later replaced completely by another weapon from this list, and Falcon could never find a home in Throne afterwards. A few expedition stints in 2020 and 2021 saved its spot on this list though. In 2020 it showed up in the main deck of a few midrange lists. In 2021 it was played in the market of a few FPS Aggro and Stonescar and Sinan midrange decks. But in both of those years it didn't really see consistent play in any expedition deck. We go right to the next set 1 card, Hammer of Might. It's a 4-power, 1 justice influence, 3/3 rare weapon with Warcry 3. Like Falcon, Hammer was highly played in the first ETS season, sparsely played in the second, and not played at all afterwards. In 2017 it was experimented with in several different Justice Aggro and midrange decks, but its only consistent home was Rakano Aggro. Like Archenport Midrange, the deck had units with Aegis, like Crownwatch Paladin and Silverwing Familiar, to reduce the risk of weapons, getting 2-for-1. Familiar was especially good with big weapons because lifesteal and flying meant that it could consistently attack, and if it attacked, it created a huge life gap between you and your opponent. The Warcry buff of Hammer was a nice bonus on top, especially if it hit one of the Aegis units, or any card that could convert the buff into damage a turn the card got played, like Soulfire Drake because of charge, or Deepforged Blade because of a huge stat buff and Overwhelm. But Rakano Aggro fell out of grace, and Hammer couldn't find another consistent home after, only seeing sporadic play in decks like FGP Aggro and FGP and Horror Unseen decks in 2018. and no play at all afterwards. Next up we have the card that replaced Falchion in Archenport midrange, Bloodletter. It's a 3 power, 1 justice and 1 shadow influence, 3/3 rare weapon that gives its wheeler lifesteal for the rest of the turn when played. It came out in set 2, Omens of the Past, towards the end of the 2017 ETS season as a 3/2 weapon. It got buffed shortly after, not having seen any play until then, but even after the buff to 3/3, it took another month, in which Tough Rod or Banker got released, for Bloodletter to see any play. Like Falchion, it was played at 3 or 4 copies in the main deck of Archenport midrange, at the start side to side with Falchion, later completely taking its place, leading to 26 tops for Bloodletter in 2018, almost all of them in Archenport midrange. After the deck fell out of favor, Bloodletter stopped seeing competitive play in Throne until autumn of 2020, when it was sporadically used in the Fearless Crescendo market of some Archenport Kira decks, because it could help stabilize against aggro, while also being able to put on additional pressure against lower decks. Bloodletter also saw some expedition play in set 8 format of early 2020, mostly in the Fearless Crescendo market of Archenport Unseen, a deck with a lot of Aegis and Exalted units who could make great use of a weapon. At rank 7 we get another set 1 card, Shogun's Scepter. It's a 3 power double fire influence 2/1 rare weapon with Warcry 1, and when you play it you also play a 2/1 Oni with Warcry 1. Scepter is a great example of a weapon that gives you immediate value in form of board presence when you play it, which makes removal less threatening, which coupled with its cheap cost made it a great card in aggro decks. In 2017 it was highly played in Rakano aggro, but only occasionally included in the usual Stonescar aggro lists. It was an important part of the only shortly existent, but in the time very successful Stonescar Cheeto variants though, mostly because the Oni it played had synergy with the deck's namesake card. After Cheeto got nerfed from 1 to 2 cost, the deck quickly died out, and Rakano aggro fell out in favor in 2018 though, so Scepter needed a new home. It found a home in Skycrack aggro. Like Rakano, the deck had Aegis units, usually Snowgrass, Seti and Vardius, and cards that could convert Warcries into damage immediately, most importantly Champion of Fury, who used to be a 2/2 at base stats back then. Scepter remained a staple in the deck until 2019, and also made it in the new Rakano aggro list of 2019, at which it could help trigger the renown of units like Hojan or Sharpshooter. But it dropped out completely after 2019. Next up we finally have a card that saw significant play post 2019, Calibus Perator. It's a 4 power double fire influence 3/3 weapon. When the wielder attacks, they deal 2 damage to the enemy player, and you get to draw a fire sigil from your deck. So again, we have a weapon that can give you immediate value. In this case, you draw a sigil and deal 2 damage, at least as long as you have a unit that can attack. It didn't have much success on release, but in 2020 it saw widespread play in Monofire and Stonescar aggro. Some of them opted to use it in the market because the curve of Ixtun Merchant and Persuader worked very nicely, but some played it in the main deck instead because both Monofire and Stonescar aggro had a lot of good targets for it. Contrary to Skycrack and Rakano, they didn't have any Aegis units, but they had overwhelm units like Merchant and back then also Milos, and flying units like the Dragon from Thunder of Wings, which could deal a lot of damage with Persuader. And the fact that it drew a sigil also made check better, because you could more consistently discard a sigil to deal 4 damage with check instead of just 2. 4 power was still a hefty cost in aggro decks though, especially for an inherently risky card like a weapon, so Persuader got dropped from most Throne aggro lists in 2021, only making a small comeback in Stonescar and Rakano aggro decks in 2022. Persuader was a part of set 7 Expedition format, in which it saw widespread play in aggro decks like Praxis or Rakano, and in Stonescar or Skycrack Dragon decks. The latter could tutor Persuader with Dragonforge, so some of them just played 1 or 2 copies to search it in situations where it was great, but the more aggressive versions of Dragon decks usually still played 3 or 4 copies, because it worked very well with mastery units like Thieving Whelp or Kozin. On rank 5 we have an even newer card, Pale Rider's Timepiece. It's a 6 power quadruple shadow influence 4/4 legendary weapon with flying, deadly, killer and lifesteal, and you can spellcraft for 6, which means you can pay 6 additional power when you play it, to play all 4 Pale Riders, who are all 4/4s, with one of the 4 timepiece battle skills each. Even without that spellcraft effect, which wasn't used in competitive tournaments very often because most games ended before a player reached 12 power, it is still the most expensive weapon on this list. That means it didn't just risk losing out on value, but also losing out on tempo if the opponent had removal. The combination of all its battle skills and strong stat buff could easily make up for the downside though. As long as your opponent didn't have fast speed removal, you could immediately killer any unit down, gain a bunch of life, and keep a big evasive threat around that demanded an answer. The high cost still made it an awkward card to main deck, but that didn't stop it from seeing Expedition play in set 8 format, which didn't have any market access that could grab timepiece. In that format, it was played as a Dragonforge target in some Dragon midrange decks, and a 2 or 3 copies in the main deck of Xenon, Archenport, Falon, and Mono Shadow midrange. In Throne, it didn't find a home immediately, only seeing occasional play in the market of different Xenon midrange decks. That changed in late 2021, when it became a staple in Stone Scar Seal, a grindy midrange deck that could get to 6 power quite well, and then use timepiece to swing games around and to stabilize the life total, which could sometimes drop quite low after drawing cards with Tuspu or reviving units with Cruel's Fate effect. Timepiece remained a staple in the deck in 2022, but it was usually moved from the main deck to the market to make the deck a bit less clunky. At the same time, it was played in the market of Xenon and Katra decks, in which it worked especially well with the region of Vinecrafter and Darkwater Vines, because that meant they could killer into a big unit and always survive. And it was also played in Archenport midrange, both main deck and market. Next up we have Sodi's Spellshaper. It's a 3 power 1 time and 1 primal influence 1/1 rare weapon. Whenever the wielder hits the opponent, you draw a card, and on activation you can pay 2 to play Equivocate, which puts a unit into its owner's hand and transforms it into a random unit of the same cost. Spellshaper came out one set before Timepiece in set 7 Flames of Xulta, right before the start of the 2020 season, at 2 instead of 3 power cost. That meant it not only could make up for the inherent weapon risk with its 2 effects, but it could also be played extremely early and snowball from there. That made it a very dangerous card in set 7 Expedition, where it was a staple in aggressive Elysian midrange decks that could make use of the tempo swing on turn 4, especially if you had a Sodi on board, because Spellshaper would trigger Muster if you used the spellcraft, which meant you got 4 power back with Sodi. And the deck couldn't make use of the additional draws following that, because the deck mostly consisted of cheap high tempo cards. But Spellshaper was so good that it was not only used in aggressive decks like that, but also in the market of slower midrange and control decks in Expedition. In set 7 Throne, it was also mostly played in aggressive Elysian decks like Elysian Nightfall, often at 3 copies in the main deck and 1 in the market, which was still possible with single faction merchants, in this case Janeth Merchant, until April 2020. Janeth Merchant made for a great carrier for a weapon like Spellshaper thanks to the Aegis, and the Equivocate on Spellshaper worked very well with the main win condition of Elysian Nightfall decks, Maul, because it gave the opponent an additional card in hand, which meant Maul could probably deal more damage. After the release of set 8, Echoes of Eternity, Spellshaper became a core card of the new tier 1 deck, Even Elysian. Even-handed Golem, who was a 2/2 that drew 2 cards at that point, and cards like Spellshaper or Teacher of Humility, back then a 3/3, not a 3/2, enabled both high tempo starts while not running out of cards, which allowed you to keep the pressure up until your opponent just couldn't answer your threats fast enough anymore. Spellshaper was nerfed directly after that Even Elysian deck reached 26 out of 64 day 2 spots in the ICQ Echoes of Eternity, and the play weight of Spellshaper in both Expedition and Throne dropped heavily as a result. It managed to make a comeback in the market of Elysian spell decks from late 2020 to 2021 though. Those decks could use Spellshaper to make their high tempo starts with cards like Wump, who used to transform into a 6/6 instead of a 4/4, even better, or to just play it on Janeth Merchant again to remove something big and to threaten repeatable card draw. Sometimes you could even live the dream and play it on Charal, while you had 8 primal influence to draw a card anytime you played a spell, because you play a spell, Charal deals damage to the opponent, which triggers the Spellshaper he's equipped with. In addition to Elysian spells, it was also part of an FTP aggro deck in 2021, in which it could be either used as a normal tempo play again, or to win with the infinite combo of Auto Threat, who used to not be a once per turn, Malaga's Amphitheater, which also used to not be once per turn, and a Spellshaper Blade on Auto Threat. Basically, you just discarded a card with Auto Threat, gained power back with Amphitheater, drew a card with Spellshaper, then you discarded the card you drew again for Auto Threat, gained power back, drew another card, and so on and so on. Both of those decks got nerfed in 2021 though, and Spellshaper hasn't really found a new home after that. At rank 3 we have another spellcraft weapon, Vanquisher's Blade. It's a 2-power, double justice influence 2/2 rare weapon that prevents all enemy cards from leaving the void. And you can pay 3 power on activation to play Vanquish, which kills a unit with 4 or more attack. Vanquisher's Blade was part of the first spellcraft wave in set 4, The Fall of Archenport, released towards the end of the 2018 ETS season. It had immediate success in ETS tournaments, showing up at 2 or 3 copies in the main deck of Compre Acro and Rakano, Compre and FGS midrange decks. The hate effect was already relevant to counter cards like Dark Return or Haunting Scream, but it became even better in the following years because more and more void-reliant decks saw competitive play, most importantly JPS and Falon Reanimator decks, built around creating huge reanimation chains with Vara, who used to not be once per turn, and Grasping at Shadows. Because of that, and because of its general strength as a buff stapled onto a removal effect, Blade saw consistent play in Compre and Rakano Acro and Toro midrange in 2019, and in Compre Acro and midrange in early 2020. Towards the end of the 2020 season, it started to see less play, and when it was played, it was usually moved to the market, because it became too inefficient and slow in games where the void hate didn't matter. It still saw occasional play in the market of Horokira and a few other Justice Acro midrange decks, but because of the high power level of other Justice market cards like Ruffian, Pristine Light or Corviate Palace, it never became a staple in them. We go right ahead with the next set for a spellcraft weapon, Sword of Unity. It's a 4-power, double justice and double time influence 2/2 legendary weapon with Overwhelm and Lifesteal, and you can use spellcrafts for 2 power to play Stand Together, which gives all your units +1/+1 in Aegis. That allows you to not only protect the wielder against 2-for-1s, but to also protect your whole board against board wipes and removal in general. Sword of Unity had a similar play history as Vanquisher's Blade. It had immediate success in the 2018 ETS season in the market and or main deck of Compre and TGP Acro and Compre midrange. It saw less play than Blade in 2019, mostly because Compre was less successful than Horo midrange, but it still showed up in pretty much every Acro or midrange list that could play it. The same can be said for the 2020 season, but after a successful start into the season, Compre died out almost completely towards the end of it. Compre midrange managed to make a small comeback at the end of 2021 and early 2022 with the Compre X list from Team Barbarian Camp, named after the fact that it played several Aegis units and cards like Sword of Unity in the market to give their units Aegis, but the main home of Swords post-2020 was Compre Relics. That deck went through multiple changes over the years thanks to nerfs and new releases, but at the core it was always a control deck built around utilizing Equalize as well as possible, which meant that it didn't play a lot of units because we of course didn't want to have a lot of units in board to make Equalize better. Instead it used ramp spells and ramp relics with additional board wipes to make up for the low board presence. The perfect market access for the deck was coveted Gemstone, released in set 10 Empire of Glass between the 2020 and 2021 season, which could grab Sword of Unity because all weapons are attachments. While those decks didn't play a lot of units, they still played enough to have a wielder for Sword of Unity most of the time, and the restriction of Gemstone meant that a lot of the usually played market cards weren't usable anyway. So most lists included Sword in the market because its lifesteal could help you stabilize if you put it onto a big unit, like the Sentinel from Builder's Decree. Because of the modest but consistent success of the deck, Sword is one of the few weapons that still saw significant competitive play in 2022. But even with that, it was still not enough to catch up to the massive lead that our rank 1 accumulated thanks to its success in earlier seasons, and that weapon is, unsurprisingly for most veteran players, Deepforged Blade. Blade is a 5-power, double fire and double justice influence 5/5 legendary weapon with Overwhelm and Endurance. Like the other simpler weapons on this list, it was part of set 1, And like the other Set 1 weapons, it had a fairly successful 2017 and a slightly less successful 2018 season. In those 2 seasons, its success was mostly tied to the success of Rakano Acro, in which it was a staple, usually played at 1 to 3 main deck, and sometimes some additional sideboard copies. Contrary to the other Set 1 weapons on this list, Blade didn't stop seeing play after 2018 though. Instead, it became even more relevant thanks to the success of FGS Midrange and the release of Red Canyon Smuggler. FGS Midrange was the most successful deck at the start of the 2019 season because it had the right mix of tempo-efficient and value-oriented cards. One specific interaction in the deck that could win games out of nowhere was equipping Red Canyon Smuggler, who was a 2/3 on release, with Blade, which the Smuggler itself could draw from the market, to attack for 14 overwhelm damage on turn 5. That combination was also important in Rakano Acro, which also had other good blade wielders like Hoshan or Sharpshooter, in which, again, a weapon could trigger the Renown effect. Blade remained important in the early tournaments of the 2020 season because FGS Midrange and Rakano Valkyries hadn't died out quite yet, but when those decks fell out of favor towards the middle of the 2020 season, Blade vanished with them, only showing up occasionally in Rakano Acro and midrange markets. The immensely successful 2017 to early 2020 period was more than enough to secure the number 1 spot on this list with an almost 60-point lead though. This marks the end of the 15th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. You can find the previous episodes and my deck history videos on my channel. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a nice week.